People often say that parents love all of their children equally. For most of my childhood, I believed that was true. Whenever my parents ignored me, I convinced myself they were just busy. Whenever they praised my younger brother and forgot about my achievements, I told myself it wasn't important. I kept hoping that one day they would finally notice how hard I was trying. Unfortunately, that day never came. My name is Ethan Carter, and I am 32 years old. Today, people see a successful businessman who owns a growing construction company, drives an expensive truck, and lives in a beautiful home. They assume I was born lucky. They have no idea that everything I built began with the worst day of my life, the day my own parents decided that my future mattered less than my brother's dream. I grew up in a quiet town outside Denver. My father owned a small hardware store, and my mother worked as a secretary at the local elementary school. We lived comfortably. We were never rich, but we never had to worry about paying the bills. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family everyone admired. Inside our home, however, there was a truth that no one wanted to admit. My younger brother, Jason, was the center of my parents' world. Every achievement of his was celebrated, no matter how small it was. If he earned an average grade at school, my parents took him out for pizza. My mother smiled proudly, and my father told everyone how hard Jason had worked. A week later, I would bring home straight A's, hoping for the same excitement. Instead, my father would glance at my report card for a few seconds before saying, "That's what you're supposed to do." Then he would return to watching television as if nothing had happened. At first, I believed they simply expected more from me. I thought maybe that was their way of showing confidence in my abilities. As the years passed, I slowly realized the truth. They didn't expect more from me. They simply appreciated me less. The moment that changed everything happened on Christmas morning when I was 15 years old. My father had promised that both Jason and I would receive brand new bicycles. For weeks, we visited the sporting goods store together. Jason wanted a blue mountain bike, while I dreamed about the black one displayed beside it. Every time we walked past those bikes, Dad smiled and said, "Just wait until Christmas." When Christmas finally arrived, Jason opened his gift first. Inside the box was the exact blue bicycle he had wanted. He shouted with excitement as my parents laughed and hugged him. Watching them, I couldn't help smiling because I believed my turn was next. Then my parents handed me my present. The box was much smaller than Jason's. I opened it carefully, expecting maybe a watch or something else I had mentioned during the year. Instead, I found my father's old toolbox. The paint was chipped, several tools were rusty, and the handle had been repaired with tape years earlier. I looked at my father, confused. I thought we were both getting bicycles. Without even looking at me, he answered, "You don't need one." Before I could respond, Jason laughed. "You can borrow mine," he said with a grin. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Then he added, "If I feel like letting you." Everyone laughed, everyone except me. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom, staring at the old toolbox beside my bed. It wasn't the bicycle that hurt. It wasn't even the gift itself. What hurt was realizing that I had spent years trying to earn the same love my brother received without even asking for it. As I lay awake, one question kept repeating in my mind. What if I was never the son they truly wanted? That Christmas stayed with me for years, but life didn't stop moving. As I grew older, I stopped looking for my parents' approval and started focusing on something they could never take away from me. I buried myself in my studies, worked every chance I got, and reminded myself that education would be my way out. If I couldn't change my family, I could still change my future. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, I had become one of the top students in the district. My teachers believed I had a bright future, and my guidance counselor encouraged me to apply to some of the best engineering programs in Colorado. Every acceptance letter felt like proof that my hard work had finally meant something. For the first time in years, I felt excited about what was waiting for me beyond that house. After school, I rarely went straight home. I spent my evenings stocking shelves at a grocery store and my weekends doing yard work, repairing fences, or helping elderly neighbors with small construction projects. The work was exhausting, but every paycheck reminded me that I was getting one step closer to my dream. I wasn't saving money for luxury or comfort. I was saving it because I knew nobody else was going to build my future for me. There was one thing that gave me even more confidence. Since the day I was born, my grandmother had quietly been putting money aside for my college education. Every birthday and every Christmas, she added a little more to the account. Whenever she handed me a birthday card, she would smile and say, "This isn't just money, Ethan. This is your opportunity. Promise me you'll use it to build a life you're proud of." I never forgot those words. Even after she passed away during my junior year, I held on to that promise. Knowing that she believed in me made it easier to ignore the disappointment I felt at home. Whenever my parents treated Jason like he could do no wrong, I reminded myself that at least one person had always seen my potential. A week before graduation, my father asked everyone to meet in the living room after dinner. His voice sounded unusually serious, and the atmosphere in the house felt strangely quiet. My mother sat beside him with her hands folded together, while Jason stood near the window without saying a word. The moment I walked into the room, I realized something important was about to happen. Dad looked at me and took a slow breath. "Ethan," he said, "we need to talk about your college fund." Hearing those words immediately made me smile because I thought we were finally discussing my future. I assumed they wanted to help me prepare for college or maybe congratulate me on earning my scholarship. I had no reason to believe anything was wrong. Instead, my father leaned back in his chair and calmly said, "We've decided to use that money for Jason." At first, I honestly thought he was joking. I waited for him to smile or tell me he was kidding, but the room remained completely silent. My mother's expression never changed, and Jason continued staring at the floor. I looked at my father in disbelief. "What do you mean you're using it for Jason?" My voice was calm, but I could already feel my heart beating faster. He answered without hesitation. "Jason wants to start his own auto detailing business, and this family believes it's a better investment." For several seconds, I couldn't find the right words. My grandmother had spent 18 years saving that money for my education, and now my parents were acting as if it belonged to them. I turned toward my mother, hoping she would tell me this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, she quietly nodded and said, "We believe this is the best decision for the family." I felt my throat tighten. "That money wasn't saved for the family," I said. "Grandma saved it for me. She wanted me to go to college." My father crossed his arms and replied, "You already earned a scholarship. You'll figure out the rest. Jason needs this chance more than you do." I slowly turned toward my brother. He still refused to look at me, and for a moment I hoped he would stand up and refuse the money. He didn't. After a long silence, he simply whispered, "I'm sorry." Those two words meant nothing because he was still willing to accept everything my grandmother had left for me. I looked back at my parents, trying to understand how the two people who were supposed to protect me could betray me so easily. "You're asking me to give up my future," I said quietly. "You're asking me to give up the only gift Grandma ever left me." My mother sighed with frustration and replied, "Stop making this harder than it needs to be." Then my father said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. He looked directly into my eyes and said, "Jason has bigger dreams than you. One day you'll understand why we made this choice." In that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't my confidence. It wasn't my ambition. It was the last piece of hope I still had that my parents would ever choose me. I didn't argue anymore. I quietly stood up, walked to my room, and packed a single suitcase. I took the $12,000 I had earned with my own hands, placed my grandmother's photograph carefully inside my backpack, and looked around the room one final time. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I realized I wasn't just leaving my house. I was leaving behind 18 years of disappointment. When I reached the front door, my mother called out, "You'll come back once you've calmed down." I didn't answer because there was nothing left to say. My father stayed in his chair, and Jason never followed me outside. As I walked into the cold evening air, I made a promise to myself that I would never again ask anyone to believe in me. From that moment on, I would build my future with my own hands, and one day, the family that had abandoned me would regret the choice they had made. The first night after leaving home, I slept inside my old Honda Civic. I parked behind a 24-hour grocery store because the parking lot stayed busy all night, and I hoped nobody would notice me. The driver's seat barely reclined, and every few minutes I woke up because my neck and back were aching. As the sun rose the next morning, one thought kept running through my mind. I had no home, but I still had a future worth fighting for. The following morning, I drove straight to the university campus. My scholarship covered part of my tuition, but it wasn't enough to pay for housing, books, food, and everything else I needed. I spent the entire day visiting different offices, asking about financial aid, work-study programs, and emergency grants. Most people were kind, but every answer sounded the same. There wasn't enough money available to cover the gap. Instead of giving up, I started looking for more work. Within 3 days, I found a night shift at a warehouse loading delivery trucks. During the mornings, I attended classes, and in the afternoons, I continued working at the grocery store where I had been employed since high school. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but every paycheck reminded me that I was still moving forward while everyone back home expected me to fail. Those first few months were harder than anything I had ever experienced. I often survived on instant noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and free coffee from the student center. There were nights when I slept only 3 hours before returning to class. My body felt exhausted almost every day, but every time I wanted to quit, I remembered my grandmother's smile and the promise I had made to her. One rainy Saturday afternoon, my warehouse supervisor asked if I could help deliver construction materials to a local job site. I accepted immediately because the extra hours meant extra money. When we arrived, I noticed an older man standing near the unfinished building, carefully studying a set of blueprints. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't shouting orders. He quietly observed every detail before speaking. As we unloaded the truck, one of the workers accidentally dropped several wooden beams onto the ground. Everyone rushed to clean up the mess, but I noticed something else. The delivery list didn't match the materials we had brought. I walked over to the older man and politely explained the mistake. He looked at the paperwork, compared it with the blueprint, and smiled. "You caught that in less than a minute," he said. "Most people wouldn't have noticed until tomorrow." I shrugged and answered honestly. I've always enjoyed paying attention to details. The man extended his hand and introduced himself. "I'm Walter Bennett." I shook his hand and told him my name. For the next 20 minutes, we talked about construction, engineering, and building design. He asked questions that none of my professors had ever asked, and I answered every one of them. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket, handed me a business card, and said, "If you're ever looking for better work, give me a call." I thanked him, placed the card inside my wallet, and drove away without thinking much about it. At the time, I had no idea that meeting Walter Bennett would become the turning point of my entire life. Sometimes the biggest opportunities arrive on the days that feel completely ordinary. While I was working 3 jobs to keep my dream alive, life back at my parents' house looked very different. Jason had officially opened his auto detailing business, using the money that had once been meant for my education. My parents proudly told everyone in town that he was the next great entrepreneur, and they believed success was only a matter of time. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. Jason posted photos online, rented a small garage, and even bought expensive equipment that he insisted every successful business needed. My father bragged about the investment he had made, and my mother couldn't stop talking about how proud she was of her younger son. Neither of them ever called to ask how I was doing. Then the problems began. Customers didn't return. Bills arrived faster than new business. Jason hired 2 friends who spent more time talking than working, and expensive equipment sat unused for days at a time. Within 4 months, the savings account that should have funded my education was almost empty. Even then, my parents refused to admit they had made a mistake. Instead, they blamed the economy, they blamed the weather, they blamed the customers, they blamed everyone except the person who had wasted $60,000. Meanwhile, I kept showing up to class every morning, working every afternoon and loading trucks every night. My life was far from easy, but for the first time, every step I took belonged to me. Nobody could take credit for my success, and nobody could take away what I earned through hard work. Late one evening, after finishing another 12-hour shift, I opened my wallet to pay for gas. Walter Bennett's business card slipped onto the driver's seat. I picked it up, stared at it for a few seconds, and remembered the conversation we had shared months earlier. Something inside me said it was finally time to make that phone call. I didn't know it yet, but that single phone call was about to change everything. I stared at Walter Bennett's business card for almost a minute before picking up my phone. It had been sitting inside my wallet for nearly 4 months, and I had almost forgotten about it. Something deep inside me kept saying that this was the opportunity I had been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I dialed the number and waited nervously for someone to answer. The phone rang twice before a calm voice came through the speaker. Walter Bennett speaking. I introduced myself and reminded him that we had met at one of his construction sites a few months earlier. There was a brief moment of silence before he laughed softly and said, "Of course I remember you. You're the young man who noticed the delivery mistake before anyone else did." His words caught me by surprise. I had assumed he had forgotten all about me, but he remembered both my name and the conversation we had shared. Before I could explain why I was calling, he interrupted me with another question. "Are you free tomorrow morning?" I looked at my class schedule and realized I didn't have lectures until the afternoon. "Yes," I replied. "I'm free." "Good," Walter said. "Be at my office at 8 o'clock. Don't worry about bringing a resume. I want to talk to you first." The next morning, I arrived almost 30 minutes early. Walter's office was nothing like I expected. It wasn't filled with expensive furniture or flashy decorations. Instead, every wall was covered with blueprints, framed photographs of completed buildings, and handwritten notes from employees thanking him for changing their lives. The place felt less like a corporate office and more like the headquarters of someone who genuinely loved building things. Walter greeted me with a warm smile and invited me into his office. For nearly an hour, he didn't ask about my grades or my work experience. Instead, he asked about my childhood, my goals, and the kind of person I wanted to become. No employer had ever asked me those questions before, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone actually wanted to understand who I was. When I finished telling him everything, the room became quiet. I even told him about my grandmother, the college fund she had saved for me, and the day my parents gave it all to Jason. Walter didn't interrupt me once. He simply listened, folded his hands together, and nodded from time to time. When I finally finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "I'm sorry they did that to you," he said. "Some parents don't realize that favoritism can destroy a family. The sad part is that they usually understand it only after it's too late." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Walter opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small folder. He slid it across the table and smiled. I'd like to offer you a part-time internship with my company. You'll work around your class schedule, and I'll pay you more than the warehouse ever could. I stared at the folder without touching it. It almost sounded too good to be true. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? I asked quietly. Walter smiled again, but this time there was something different in his expression. Because talent is easy to find, he replied. Character isn't. I believe you're the kind of young man who refuses to quit, even when life gives him every reason to. Those words stayed with me long after I left his office. Nobody had ever believed in me the way Walter did. My parents had always compared me to Jason, but Walter never mentioned him once. He only cared about the person sitting in front of him and the future that person could build. Within 2 weeks, my life began to change. I left the warehouse job and started working with Walter's team after classes. Every day felt like a new lesson. I learned how construction projects were planned, how contracts were negotiated, and how successful companies earned the trust of their clients. Walter treated every employee with respect, whether they were a senior engineer or a new apprentice carrying tools across the job site. One afternoon, while we were reviewing blueprints together, Walter looked at me and asked, "Have you ever thought about starting your own company one day?" I laughed because the idea sounded impossible. I was still struggling to pay rent, buy textbooks, and keep my old Honda running. Owning a business felt like a dream that belonged to someone else. Walter shook his head and pointed toward the blueprint on the table. Every successful company starts with one person who refuses to give up. Don't measure your future by your current circumstances. Measure it by your determination. Those words became part of my life. I wrote them inside the front cover of every notebook I owned. Whenever I felt exhausted or overwhelmed, I read them again. Slowly, I stopped seeing myself as the forgotten son who had been abandoned by his family. I started seeing myself as a man who was building something far greater than the life he had lost. While my confidence continued to grow, Jason's business was moving in the opposite direction. His garage was almost always empty, and unpaid bills had started piling up on the kitchen table back home. Instead of admitting he needed help, Jason borrowed more money from my parents. They couldn't afford it, but they gave it to him anyway because they believed one more investment would solve everything. By the end of the year, the business had lost almost every dollar my grandmother had spent 18 years saving for my education. My parents were too embarrassed to tell anyone what had happened, so they pretended everything was fine. They smiled in public, but behind closed doors, the arguments had already begun. I knew nothing about those problems because nobody from my family had called me since the day I walked away. The silence no longer hurt the way it once had. I was too busy building a future that belonged entirely to me. One evening, as I prepared to leave Walter's office, he stopped me at the door. He handed me a sealed envelope and said, "You've earned this. Open it when you get home." I thanked him, placed the envelope inside my backpack, and drove back to my apartment. I had no idea that what was inside would change my life forever. The moment I stepped into my apartment, I placed my backpack on the kitchen table and pulled out the envelope Walter had given me. It was heavier than I expected, and my hands felt strangely nervous as I opened it. Inside, there was a folded letter, a company ID badge with my name on it, and a check. I stared at the number for several seconds because I honestly thought I had read it wrong. The check was for $20,000. I looked back at the letter, hoping it would explain why Walter had given me so much money. Taking a deep breath, I unfolded the paper and began reading. The first sentence immediately brought tears to my eyes. "Ethan, this isn't charity. This is an investment in someone who has already proven his value." I continued reading every word carefully. Walter explained that he had been watching me for nearly a year, not only at work but also through the people who worked with me. Every supervisor had described me the same way. They said I arrived early, stayed late, never complained, and always looked for solutions instead of excuses. According to Walter, those qualities were far more valuable than experience. The letter continued by saying that the $20,000 was a scholarship from his private foundation. He had created it years earlier for hard-working students who had been treated unfairly by life but refused to give up. The money would cover the remainder of my tuition, my textbooks, and enough living expenses to allow me to reduce my working hours and focus on finishing my engineering degree. I lowered the letter and covered my face with both hands. For the first time since leaving home, I cried without feeling ashamed. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. After spending my entire life believing that nobody truly believed in me, a man who wasn't even related to me had given me the greatest opportunity I had ever received. The following Monday, Walter officially introduced me to the engineering department. Instead of treating me like an intern, he encouraged me to sit in meetings, ask questions, and share my ideas. At first, I felt intimidated because everyone around the table had years of experience. To my surprise, Walter often asked for my opinion before anyone else's. A few months later, one of the company's largest commercial projects ran into a serious problem. The original structural design would push the construction costs far beyond the client's budget. Several senior engineers spent days searching for a solution, but nothing seemed practical. Walter asked if I wanted to take a look. I spent the entire night reviewing the blueprints. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I noticed a different approach that could reduce material costs without sacrificing safety. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was worth presenting. The next morning, I nervously explained my idea to the engineering team. The room remained silent after I finished speaking. Then one engineer slowly nodded. Another engineer began checking the calculations. Within 20 minutes, everyone realized the revised design actually worked. It saved the client nearly $1 million and allowed the project to move forward without delays. Walter smiled proudly as the meeting ended. He walked over, shook my hand, and said, "This is exactly why I believed in you." Hearing those words meant more to me than any paycheck I had ever earned. For years, I had been treated like I wasn't good enough. Now, someone I respected was telling me that my ideas had helped save one of the company's biggest projects. While my career continued moving forward, life back home was falling apart. Jason's business had officially failed, and there was no money left to keep the doors open. Most of the expensive equipment had already been sold just to pay overdue bills. The dream my parents had invested everything in had disappeared faster than anyone expected. My father refused to admit the truth. Instead of accepting that Jason had made poor decisions, he blamed the economy and accused customers of being unfair. My mother quietly watched the arguments grow worse every week, but she still defended Jason whenever anyone questioned his choices. Neither of them wanted to admit that they had sacrificed one son's future for a business that lasted less than 2 years. One evening, my Aunt Karen stopped by their house for dinner. During the conversation, she casually asked how I was doing because she hadn't seen me in a long time. My parents exchanged uncomfortable looks before admitting they hadn't spoken to me since the day I left home. Karen stared at them in complete disbelief. "You mean your son disappeared almost 2 years ago?" she asked quietly. "And neither of you tried to find him?" The room became completely silent. Then Karen asked another question. "What happened to the college fund Grandma spent 18 years saving?" Nobody answered. Jason lowered his head. My mother looked away. My father's expression slowly changed as he realized there was no explanation that could justify what they had done. For the first time, someone outside the family knew the truth. And for the first time, my parents were forced to face the consequences of their decision. They still had no idea where I was. They had no idea that I was about to graduate at the top of my engineering class, and they certainly had no idea that the son they had abandoned was slowly becoming the most successful person in the entire Carter family. The envelope Walter gave me that evening changed everything. Inside was not only the scholarship check that covered the rest of my education, but also a handwritten note that I kept for years. He wrote that success was never determined by where someone started. It was determined by how they responded when life became unfair. I folded that letter carefully and carried it inside my wallet every single day because it reminded me that at least one person truly believed in me. From that day forward, I stopped worrying about surviving and started focusing on becoming the best engineer I could possibly be. Without the pressure of working 3 exhausting jobs, I finally had enough time to study, attend every lecture, and gain practical experience at Walter's company. Every project became another opportunity to learn something new. The more responsibility Walter gave me, the more determined I became to prove that his trust had not been misplaced. Walter never treated me like an ordinary intern. He invited me into meetings with architects, engineers, and project managers, even when I had very little experience. Sometimes I didn't say a single word because I was busy listening and learning. Other times, Walter would suddenly ask for my opinion in front of everyone. Those moments terrified me at first, but they slowly built a confidence that I had never felt during my childhood. One afternoon, our team faced a serious problem on a commercial construction project that had already fallen behind schedule. The client was threatening to cancel the contract because material costs had increased far beyond the original estimate. Several senior engineers spent 2 days searching for a solution, but none of the proposals seemed practical. Walter quietly handed me a copy of the blueprints and said, "Take them home tonight. I want to know what you see." I spent nearly the entire night studying every page of those drawings. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I noticed that one section of the structural design could be simplified without affecting the building's safety or quality. I checked my calculations 3 different times because I couldn't believe something so simple had been overlooked. The next morning, I presented my idea to the engineering team with shaking hands, fully expecting them to dismiss it. Instead, the room became completely silent as everyone reviewed the revised calculations. One engineer nodded slowly before asking another to verify the numbers. Within half an hour, the entire team agreed that the new design would save the client almost $1 million while keeping the project on schedule. Walter smiled proudly, looked around the room, and said, "This young man just solved a problem that none of us could solve. Never underestimate someone because of their age." That day changed the way everyone in the company looked at me. I was no longer just the hardworking college student who stayed late every evening. I became someone whose ideas were respected by experienced professionals. My confidence grew with every project, and for the first time in my life, I stopped wondering whether I was good enough. I finally understood that my parents had never defined my value. They had only failed to recognize it. 3 years later, I graduated at the top of my engineering class. Walter attended the graduation ceremony with his wife, and they applauded louder than anyone else when my name was announced. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I couldn't help thinking about my grandmother. She had believed in me long before anyone else did, and I wished she could have seen that moment with her own eyes. A week after graduation, Walter invited me to dinner at his home. I assumed we were celebrating my degree, but the conversation quickly became more serious. He told me that many large construction companies had already contacted me with job offers because they had heard about my work on several successful projects. Then he smiled and placed another envelope on the table. Inside was a full-time employment contract. The salary was far higher than anything I had expected, and the benefits were even better. Before I had the chance to thank him, Walter looked at me and said, "This isn't the reason I asked you here tonight. I have something much bigger in mind for your future." His words immediately caught my attention. Walter explained that he wasn't looking for someone to simply work for him. He wanted someone who could eventually lead the company after he retired. He believed that businesses could teach people how to build structures, but character could never be taught in a classroom. According to him, I had already proven that I possessed the one quality money could never buy. For a few moments, I couldn't say anything. Just 10 years earlier, I had been sleeping inside my old Honda with nowhere to go. Now, one of the most respected construction company owners in the state was talking about preparing me to become his successor. Life had changed so dramatically that it almost felt unreal, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never waste the opportunity that someone else had sacrificed so much to give me. As I drove home that night, I looked at the old photograph of my grandmother that I still kept inside my wallet. I smiled quietly and thanked her for believing in me when nobody else did. At the same time, I had no idea that life was about to bring my past back to my front door. Hundreds of miles away, my parents had just made a decision that would change all of our lives once again. Almost 10 years had passed since the night I walked away from my parents' house with nothing but a single suitcase and $12,000. During those years, my life had changed in ways I could never have imagined. Walter had officially retired, and after years of working beside him, I became the new owner of Bennett Construction. We had expanded across several states, employed hundreds of people, and built a reputation that clients trusted without hesitation. Every success reminded me that the future my parents tried to take away had become far greater than anything they had imagined. Even with everything I had achieved, I rarely thought about my family anymore. The anger that once kept me awake at night had slowly disappeared, replaced by something much healthier. I had learned that carrying resentment only gave the past more power over my future. Instead of wondering whether my parents regretted their decision, I focused on the people who had stood beside me when I had nothing. Walter became the father figure I never had, and the employees at the company became the family I had chosen through trust instead of blood. One quiet Saturday morning, I was sitting on the back patio of my home with a cup of coffee and several project reports spread across the table. The weather was calm, and the only sounds came from birds singing in the trees behind the house. My phone had been silent all morning, and I was enjoying a rare weekend without meetings or deadlines. Then the doorbell rang, breaking the peaceful silence that surrounded the house. I walked to the front door without thinking much about it. Through the glass beside the entrance, I noticed 3 figures standing on the porch. As I unlocked the door and slowly opened it, my heart stopped for a brief moment. Standing in front of me were my mother, my father, and Jason, looking older, weaker, and far more tired than I had ever seen them before. None of us spoke for several seconds. My mother's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw me, while my father kept staring at the ground as if he couldn't find the courage to look into my eyes. Jason stood quietly behind them with his hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact just as he had done on the day they took my college fund. The silence between us carried the weight of 10 painful years that none of us could erase. Finally, my father took a slow breath and spoke in a voice that sounded completely different from the one I remembered. "Ethan," he said quietly, "we know we have no right to ask anything from you, but we desperately need your help." Hearing those words felt almost unreal because they came from the same man who had once told me that I would simply have to figure life out on my own. Time had taken away the confidence that used to fill his voice, leaving behind only regret. I stepped aside and invited them into the house because I wanted to hear everything before making any decision. They sat together in the living room while I remained across from them, listening without interrupting. My mother explained that the hardware store had closed years earlier after a long financial struggle. Jason's business had failed, their savings had disappeared, and the family home had eventually been sold to pay off debts they could no longer manage. As the conversation continued, my father admitted something I never expected to hear. He said that every decision they had made had been based on the belief that Jason simply needed more help than I did. They convinced themselves that I would succeed no matter what happened because I had always worked harder and expected less from them. Looking back, he realized that they had mistaken my independence for strength and Jason's dependence for potential. My mother wiped away her tears before speaking again. She admitted that after I left home, she often stood outside my empty bedroom wondering whether I would ever return. Pride kept both of them from calling me because they believed I would eventually come back on my own. As the years passed, that silence became too heavy to break, and every birthday reminded them that they had lost one son while trying to protect the other. Jason finally looked directly at me for the first time that day. His voice trembled as he admitted that he should never have accepted the money Grandma had saved for my education. He confessed that he had thought success would erase his guilt, but every failure only reminded him of what he had taken from me. He apologized without making excuses, saying that he had spent years wishing he could go back and refuse the money that never belonged to him. I listened carefully to every word, but I didn't interrupt anyone. The pain I had carried for so many years no longer controlled my emotions because life had already given me everything I needed to heal. I realized that the people sitting across from me were no longer the confident family who believed they had made the right decision. They were broken individuals living with the consequences of choices they could never undo. After several minutes of silence, I stood up and walked toward the large window overlooking the backyard. I remembered the frightened 18-year-old who had once believed his life was over because his own parents had abandoned him. If someone had told that young man he would one day own a successful company, lead hundreds of employees, and build a life filled with respect, he never would have believed it. Looking back, I understood that leaving home had been the beginning of my future, not the end of it. I turned around and faced my family with complete calm. "I don't hate any of you," I said quietly. "I stopped carrying that anger a long time ago because it was hurting me more than it was hurting you. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it allows someone to stop living inside it." My words filled the room with another long silence as each of them struggled to hold back tears. I walked to my office, opened a drawer, and returned with a sealed envelope. Inside was a cashier's check large enough to help them rent a small apartment, pay off their most urgent debts, and begin rebuilding their lives. I placed it on the table and told them that I wasn't giving them the money because they deserved it. I was giving it because my grandmother had taught me that kindness should never depend on how others treated us. My father reached for the envelope with shaking hands, but before he picked it up, I gently placed my hand on top of it. I looked at all three of them and spoke as calmly as I could. "This is the last thing I will ever give you as your son. I sincerely hope you rebuild your lives, find peace, and learn from everything that happened. But the family I needed disappeared the day you chose my future for someone else's dream." No one argued with my decision because deep inside, they already knew it was fair. My mother quietly whispered that she loved me before walking toward the front door. My father stopped beside me for a brief moment and simply said, "I'm proud of the man you became." They were words I had waited my entire childhood to hear, but by then I no longer needed them to believe in myself. A week later, I drove to the cemetery carrying a bouquet of fresh white lilies. I placed the flowers beside my grandmother's headstone and sat there in complete silence, remembering every conversation we had shared when I was a child. She had once told me that no one could ever take away an education or a person's character, and she had been right all along. As I stood up to leave, I smiled softly and whispered, "We did it, Grandma. We really did it." As I walked back toward my car, I realized that success had never been about becoming richer than the people who doubted me. Success was waking up every morning without bitterness, knowing that I had built an honest life with my own hands. My parents had taken away the future they imagined for me, but they had unknowingly pushed me toward an even greater one. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't proving them wrong. It was proving to myself that I had always been enough.